This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley from Respectonomics, and this morning we are talking about a very complex subject. We're talking about relationships in the community. I'm being co-hosted with Sarah Benton, and together we want to help us to explore how we develop relationships in our community.
Wonderful. Good morning, Jeremy.
Good morning, Sarah.
So, as Jeremy mentioned, we will be diving into the complex web of community relationships today, talking about the spaces we share, the bonds we form, and how care or carelessness can shape these connections. Communities, whether they're chosen, they're circumstantial, or they're imposed, play a vital role in our lives. And so today we're going to explore what it truly means to be part of a community, the dynamics of the family model within it, and the emotional layers that come with visibility, listening, and withdrawal. And then finally, we will touch on the role of therapy in nurturing or healing these relationships. So first and foremost, Jeremy, what do you mean when you refer to the family model? What does that mean to you?
Well, I was brought up in a very traditional family model. There was mum and dad, there were the three children, and our lives were really, when I think back on it, were remarkably prescribed. But there was one thing about it that I think there were two things about it that hit me compared with the family model today. One is that the family model that we had was very ubiquitous. It was everywhere. If we went to school, if we went to a party, if we were out with friends, the actual family organization, the family structure was pretty much identical. And it was usually under a heading of great sadness when it wasn't. It would be, perhaps one of the parents had died. It might be they had divorced. But on the whole, the connected family unit was very much part of the paradigm. The second thing, though, that I think was important was that we came out, and part of me thinks it was very Victorian, very puritanical, and all those, even colonial, really. But when I think of those backgrounds, the one thing that did come out, though, was there was a hierarchy. There was mum and dad. There was a sense, I think, probably that father had the last word. I'm not sure about that. I'm really not. But the family unit I'm talking about was very clear on what we were expected to be able to do and so on.
Okay.
I was very fortunate. I never had anybody say to me, you can do anything you want. So it was much more left to me to figure out what I thought I wanted to do.
Mm.
I'm not saying I was well encouraged, but I didn't have that sort of ghastly open-endedness, which I think today a lot of families deal in open-endedness with this great line, you can do whatever you put your mind to. Well, I'll give you an example. I was in the school play. I was Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing.
Mm.
And I was fired from the part
You
because
got fired,
I
and why?
got fired. I know what it feels like. And I got fired because I couldn't dance. So from
Oh,
that, I could extrapolate quite reasonably. I was unlikely to be a ballet dancer.
fair enough.
Fair enough. But going back to the hierarchy of it, there was one thing about this hierarchical arrangement. And I know in today's world we think far more democratically and evenly, and we think in terms of equitable treatment and so on. But there is one thing that I did that was sort of infused into me. And I don't want to use the word duty. That sounds a bit
Mhm.
heavy.
Harsh.
Yeah,
Yes.
harsh. But I think the word that does come to mind was the sense of expectation of what I was being asked to do. So whether it was to put the garbage out, or whether it was to go and polish somebody's shoes, or whether it was to clean a window, whatever it was, there was a sense of expectation of what
Mhm.
would I have to do. And in fact, I think I've got this right, in the Jewish tradition, the bar mitzvah takes place when the boy is what, 13 years old, I think?
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. And the connection there is, it was at that stage that the boy is starting to come into manhood.
Hmm.
Fine. But what they all realized was, the ancient tribes realized was, that when you're coming into manhood, you need to have duties and responsibilities to offset what otherwise is going to send you into scary, scary places. and doing some
Hmm.
probably foolish things. So I
Right.
don't think the sense of what I was being asked to do was unfair. But I think it did produce this sense of expectation. If you talk to people now, employers, you know how often you hear young people don't know how to work? I mean, you've heard that line
Yes.
way too
Yes.
often.
Numerous times.
And we're
Yes.
going to talk about that, please. The answer, though, is that I think if you're bred with the sense of responsibilities, expectations, I don't think the word duties is quite the right word. That sounds a bit militaristic.
Yes. Yes.
But
Agreed.
I think the degree of expectation is an important dynamic. So that's how I saw I see the family unit today. And of course, the family unit today has one other great, not, I don't know if you call it a difficulty or it's part of the tapestry, I'm not sure. But the difficulty is that a family unit today is no longer definable. Mine was mum, dad, three children, two children,
Right.
and, it was a very conventional arrangement. The arrangement today is completely different. I'm not being critical. I'm not
Right. There's
judging.
there's there's many definitions of family, what
Yeah,
family, the
yeah,
family unit looks like
right.
or
Yeah,
feels like.
yeah.
Absolutely. So when it comes to from a community standpoint, so how do you define community and what factors determine whether it feels like a choice, a circumstance, or something that's imposed? Because this is good to sort of baseline for us for conversation.
Well, I find it interesting because in our pre-production discussions, I had said to you that I thought we should talk about the relationships as they relate to people, individuals,
Right.
and you quite rightly broadened it out to the word community. And I
Hmm.
think community is an interesting word. You know how we always go back to Latin?
Oh, we do.
Well, okay, here we go again. Are you
We're
ready?
ready. We're
Okay, no
ready.
Shakespeare, just Latin. No, the word community is co, which we know that means together. But the munio is a very interesting word. It means to fortify. So
Hmm.
we are, in fact, in community. It's very tribal. It's actually for our own protection. We build each other up so that we can defend ourselves, so that we are less vulnerable to whether it's attacks or diseases or whatever it might be, even
Hmm.
nature, for heaven's sake. So
Right.
it brings out this full sense of needing each other and the way in which we can build each other up. From that, I think we can then get into the business of, well, how do I do that? In the
Hmm.
last two podcasts, particularly in this series, we have talked about relationships as they relate to business and to the political orbit. And I must confess to you, I think you were ahead of me on this one, because I thought when I started on this whole adventure, this whole aspiration of respectonomics, I thought the first protocol would be relationships within a business organization. And it didn't take me long to figure out, well, business organizations can go beyond just the straightforward, you know, profit and
Absolutely.
loss and business and so on. But what
Yes.
I've come down to is this, and I think you were there already with your background in human resources, and that is, I think, and I'd like your comment on this,
Yes, of course.
please. I think that getting your community relationship right, meaning your relationship with your fellow human being, establishing community and so on, is actually the prerequisite to having relationships that work either in business or politics or in any organization. In other words, it starts with me.
Absolutely. I would agree with that statement 100%. I think the relationship with ourselves then contributes to how we are in terms of relationships within our community. So whether that be team environment, your day-to-day going ons in your community, going out, speaking with people, going to local
Yeah,
businesses. It could be volunteer work, like anything that is community based. I mean, that's such a broad, you know, topic in terms of from a
mhm,
definition standpoint. But absolutely, I think it's a ripple effect, and then that also then carries over into your work. So how you maybe perhaps treat your neighbor even or a family member or again you're somebody in the community
yeah.
also translates to how you treat colleagues or coworkers in the work environment.
Well, I agree with that. And I think the if you remember from I think it was one meeting ago, we talked about how that when we have decent relationships with each other,
Hmm.
that we talked about how that improves productivity and so on. But the one thing we also recognized was the ability to recognize one another in a decent relationship
Right.
migrates to the way in which we treat our customers and our shareholders, our suppliers,
Absolutely.
in fact, all of the people that are contiguous to our lives. So I
Absolutely.
think getting this right within ourselves is the number one determinant. Number two determinant is to establish these rites of passage, if you will, within our own immediate community. I
Right.
have
Right.
a feeling we've been pushing that aside and thinking, I don't need to bother about my situation. I'll go and whatever it is at work. I think it shows. And I think that lack of, I think you use the word empathy. It's one of
Right.
your, yeah, important aspects to your work. But I think that if we aren't showing each other that dignity,
Hmm.
then in fact it migrates right the way through the system.
Absolutely.
I think
Ab-
isn't in the archaeology world, don't they, or whatever they call it, isn't a rock can call, don't they talk about rocks being permeacity or permeous or something, which means
Yes.
that they're the same all the way through.
Hmm.
Well, I think that's what we are. We are humans all the way through, and it reflects in wherever and whatever we're doing.
Right. Do you, when it comes to community,
Hmm.
do you think there are times where, again, just kind of looking to really narrow it down in terms of from a defining standpoint, is it a choice or is it circumstances or can it be imposed on us? Like,
Well, I think your question is completely on the money because every time you're in a community, every time you're in a circumstance with another individual, there are
mhm,
three ways it can happen. In the family situation, love it or leave it, you have a brother and a sister. That was imposed on you.
right,
Sorry. Or maybe you enjoy your brothers and sisters, and that's fine. But you can get the point that that's what the hand that we're dealt, if you will. Then,
right,
of course, there's the circumstantial one where we're around people at work and in the pubs and wherever we might be. And in that case, that is, I would say, circumstantial. And then there is
okay.
that other one, which just comes out of nowhere. And you find
Hmm.
yourself almost like a blob in the middle of the ocean. And you look around thinking, what on the earth am I doing here? And in all three, we still have to come to grips with my relationship as a human being with the
Right,
other human being. So whether it's my brother, whether it's somebody at work, or somebody that I was never expecting to talk to or see, I think the same metric applies. As a matter of fact, if we go through the logic of this, the way that I treat my brother will presumably be the way that I treat any of those other people in those other categories.
right. There's
I can't,
foundational elements
what's that?
to how we treat. There's foundational elements to how we treat people, and that
I
carries
think so.
forward throughout our
And
day.
I think the importance of this discussion is to come to grips with the necessity of understanding this foundational value. One
Hmm.
of the things I've discovered is, and it sounds a little bit distant, but people watch us all the time. And a classic example is that apparently, if you leave your office downtown New York or Toronto, wherever you are, you leave your office and you go out to the local sandwich bar, get a sandwich and what's that tea you drink? David's, what is it?
Oh, that one's a David's Cold Tea
Yeah,
911.
okay, okay. Well, other people
That's
go
only
out.
on special occasions.
Okay, real men go out and have chocolate milk.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
So anyway, but it's interesting when you go out like that and you come back in. Do you know you will have been seen by 5,000 people in that
Interesting.
10-minute, whatever it was? And I mean, I'm not quite sure how the statistic was arrived at, but in fact, with the CCTV cameras today, that number's probably even higher, actually. So we
Okay.
are
Yeah.
very, very seen. So how we are seen, of course, is how people interact with us. I mean, yeah.
Right.
So that's
Perceive.
one part of the puzzle. They also hear us. And
Mm,
one of the things that people are looking for, and I think are desperately looking for in today's world, is authentic information. And one of the most authentic things that I can do as a human being is not tell you how clever I am, not
mhm.
discuss my manliness and whether I like chocolate milk or not, But one of the things I can do is be very clear with you that I am fallible. Being
Mm.
fallible is a very different discussion from, oh, yes, I make mistakes. I read about a politician recently who, before he got elected, said, yes, I expect to make mistakes. Well, that was almost like an out. That's almost like I'm going to make them, but now that I've said I'm going to make them, that takes me off the hook,
Right. That covers me.
covers me. No, in the real world, we need to understand our fallibility. And
Hmm.
there are things about me, believe it or not, that I do not like. There are things
Mm.
that won't change in me because they're DNA material,
Right.
just the way it is, you know. If you
I
look
think that's
carefully,
pretty common across the board.
yeah, if you look at the camera carefully, you'll notice that my one of my shoulders is actually longer than the other. Hmm.
I did not notice.
Yeah, well, that's because I wear a jacket to hide it. But serious, I mean, in fact, that's a very valid point. How much do we do to hide our
Mm.
fallibility? I think being able to talk about one's fallibilities, I don't mean washing your laundry in public, and that's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
But for example, you come from a financial business world, I do too. And how many times did you see that letter that said, we apologize for the inconvenience we may have caused you? You remember
Yes.
that letter?
Many a times.
Yeah,
Yes.
many times. The letter that will stop people in their tracks and stops people word face to face like this is when I say to you, Sarah, I failed,
Hmm.
period.
Right.
And the advantage of that is I'm first of all admitting it was a failure, therefore
Vulnerability.
needs to be fixed. But also the other thing is it's reminiscent of the fact that every human being is fallible. So I'm
Right.
not putting myself above or below you. I'm in fact drawing alongside you. You
And
have
I
your
find,
fallibilities, I have mine.
yeah, and I find vulnerability engenders trust,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And can a sense of belonging be cultivated in a community that wasn't initially chosen, do you think?
Well, your question about belonging is a hugely important issue today
Hmm.
because so many people do not feel they belong. As a matter of fact, going back to your family unit concept, I wonder if the way that we have dissolved the sort of the parameters of a traditional family, I wonder, in fact, if we haven't lost a lot of that sense of belongingness. I just wonder. I don't
Hmm.
hear people talking about their families the way they did 20, 30 years ago. I just don't. Maybe you do, but
Yeah. That's an interesting thought. I actually tend to find that people do speak of their families. Like you say, the structure
mhm.
may be different,
Yeah.
and perhaps the expectations may be different. As we've moved through time, like I think things change. However, I feel that there is a sense of, or I get a sense of family when I listen to people talk and
Okay.
speaking about their families. Like I say, the structure may not be as formalized, or it may look very different.
Hmm.
Or again, expectations. I think that's a
Right.
big one, right? What was expected of even like myself growing up as a child
Hmm.
is different than the expectations of what are imposed, if you will, on my children in terms of
Right.
growing up. It's
Yeah.
it's it's changed, or it's
Yeah.
morphed,
So it's
or
maybe what I'm reflecting to you is more of the differences in the family rather than that the family has been discounted or removed.
yes, yeah. I
But,
think that's a great
no,
great summary.
yeah. However,
Yeah.
the snag is this business of belonging is, and we see it in many different ways. The most obvious way, of course, is remote learning or remote activity.
Yes.
And
Wow.
that's a
Never
critical
had an
problem. Like
impact.
JP Morgan, as you may have seen today, has basically said everybody comes back to the office on March the 1st.
Yes.
I don't think they've handled it particularly well because they're sort of doing that sort of softy feely, we're asking everybody to come back. In brackets,
Mm.
if you don't, you'll get fired.
Right.
That which
Right.
I think that lacks integrity doing it that way. I
Mm.
think it'd be
Interesting.
far better if they said, we are demanding that you come back and here are the reasons, or demanding that that's
Right.
a business
This is the
model.
model of our
Yeah,
work environment.
yeah,
This is how it
yeah,
always worked. We
yeah,
make concessions due
yeah.
to
Of
circumstances
course.
at that time. However, we're
Yeah,
going back to,
yeah, yeah,
how we
yeah.
felt things worked efficiently and effectively.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, interesting.
So, but
So,
sorry,
sorry, go
go
ahead.
on. No, please, Sarah.
Well, no, I'd like you to finish that thought because I was going to move on to feelings.
Well, what I was also going to say, the sense of belonging, we talked about the remote issues that we deal with. The
Hmm.
internet, of course, has greatly reduced our ability to interact with each other, which sounds almost illogical, irrational, you'd say, but the internet is connecting everybody. Well, yeah, it connects everybody electronically and digitally, robotically, but it
Hmm.
doesn't connect people, what you might call soul to soul, heart to heart. It
Right.
doesn't. And
Funny you make that statement because prior to everybody having cell phones or tablets in their
right.
hands,
Hmm.
let's say you're somewhere and you're waiting for somebody,
Hmm.
right? You might be more inclined to strike up a conversation with somebody beside you or say hello or engage in communication with another human being. With the cell phones, though, it's you have almost, and I'm not going to say it's the right companion, but it's how I'm going to label
I
it.
think it's a, yeah,
You almost have a consistent companion in your hand, which you might be engaging with that, but you're not engaging with the outside.
I think that's exactly right. It was
Yeah.
kind of interesting. Last week, I was, as you know, I was at the Lion King on the stage production
Yeah.
and sitting next to this fellow who's an engineer from Newfoundland. We got into quite the conversation. We really did. And he was
Hmm.
there with his granddaughter. It was a special treat for everybody and all this. But the key point is exactly what you said. He didn't have a cell phone. I didn't have a cell phone. You're sitting in a theater next to each other. Why wouldn't you talk?
Right.
And I think the other thing is, and this is maybe pushing the envelope a bit, but I find that people today find it difficult to have conversations with other people. And
Hmm.
that's almost a vortex in itself, because if I find it difficult to talk with somebody and therefore do
Right.
not, the next conversation is actually incrementally more difficult. And
And I
so,
think that I think technology's had a huge impact
yeah,
on that generationally as we've
right,
gone along.
right,
Right. Like I say,
yeah,
it's instant. I have something to keep me company while
right,
I'm waiting.
yeah,
Because I
yeah,
can be looking at something, searching
right,
something, so it feels like I'm
right,
not alone,
right.
but when actual fact,
Well, I know that I'm going back quite a few years, but one of the psychology, what would you call it, lessons we had
hmm,
in business was the ability, the willingness, in fact, the obligation to strike up a conversation with three people you didn't know every day. And
right.
it's a fascinating experience.
Hmm.
People, first of all, there's your uncle's great line, and we always give Uncle Derek, we always give him the credit for this line, which
Yeah,
is, how is your day going?
right.
I think it's an opening question that you can ask anybody at the bus stop, in
Absolutely.
the, in the bar, wherever you might be. How's your day going? And I
It's
just want
amazing
to,
the information you can get back from
oh,
a stranger when you ask that question.
unbelievable. Well, the information, I'm going back to the one at the Lion King, from the engineer, the
Right.
information that he imparted to me was incredible. It really was.
Hmm.
It's material for another podcast, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Your
Yeah,
opportunities.
exactly. But I want to say one thing, though, about when we talk with other people, we express the dignity to that other individual. We bring them into our own orbit and all these good things. And we've already explored how that migrates into all phases of our lives. But
Hmm.
I think there's one phase where it's very, very important. And maybe this preaches to the fallibility issue with each of us. But my goodness, it is so easy to forget those basic rules. Do you call them rules? Guidelines,
Sure.
railway
Guidelines.
tracks,
Yeah. Yep.
guidelines. It's so easy to set them aside with people
Mm,
closest to us.
absolutely.
It's a reminder to me,
Whether
even as I
that's
say it, I'm reminding me,
Yes. Whether that's just comfortability, whether we view
yeah,
that ourselves as that's just because I'm comfortable,
yeah,
or
right,
is it that you're not taking advantage, that's not the right word,
no,
but you're remiss in the fact that
yeah.
it's there. You don't
Well,
need to
I do
engage,
have a
right?
psychological term that goes with that, which I think is very important actually in today's
Mm,
world. And it's called the FID factor. And the FID
mm,
factor is a way of expressing how we get rejected. And
mm,
the F
mm.
stands for frequency. So if
Okay.
I say to you, every time I see you, I don't like you, it won't take you very long to just get out of my life and I'll get out of your life.
Right.
That's what we do. If, on the other hand, you go to your office one morning and you find out they've changed the door locks without telling you,
Hmm.
that's intense. That's the I.
Quite direct.
Yeah, you are just, you know, you are no longer wanted. Slam dunk, done.
Hmm.
The D, though, is the duration. And the
Mm.
allegory that goes with that is the butler who's been in service for 40 years walks into the lady of the house's whatever bedroom, whatever, goes in there and says, "Ma'am, I am resigning immediately." And she looks in absolute horror and says, "What are you talking about? You've been with us for 40 years." And he
Mm.
says, "Ma'am, in those 40 years, you never once said good morning to me."
Wow.
And it's that whole business of it's accretive, it's a build-up factor, and eventually something will prick the bubble and it destroys everything. So I think the D of the FID factor, the duration issue,
Mm.
very important that in our own personal arrangements and anything, I mean, with my wife, for example, I mean, surely to goodness, the case is much better made when I say thank you for well, this morning she went out and blew the laneway out
Right.
so that
Right.
we could have this call. That to
Right.
me is very worthy and it's almost obvious that you would say, hey, thank you.
Right.
No.
Right. Yes. Yes. Don't put
No.
it to the wayside. Be intentional.
Very, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to say one other thing too. Yesterday I was listening to one of Warren Buffett's discourses, and it was very interesting. He was talking to a young, well, I shouldn't say young, but a group of small business managers
Hmm.
and
Okay.
talking about their business outlook and so on. And he didn't once mention, this is Warren Buffett, what, the wealthiest, I mean, some people say the second, but it doesn't really matter, wealthiest investor in the world and so on. And it was so interesting that, in fact, he never really mentioned product. He didn't really talk about the quality of their product, but he did say the important thing is to delight your customer. That is the one thing that we can all do is to delight the customer. And when you delight the customer, that customer will always have that experience of delight. I
Mm.
mean, you go out and have a lovely meal, that's fine. Food is always good. But it's also interesting that when you get that really, really first class service, where you're treated, just treated nicely.
Yes.
We had that with your family
Yes.
back
Yeah.
in,
It
was
gives you
it?
a completely different experience.
Yeah. So all he said was, he says two things. One is that the necessity of delighting your customer and the power that has in it. And then he also pointed out, and this is very important in a community setting, because what I've just said about delighting the customer is very individualistic. If I
Right.
delight you, that's great. But the multiplier effect is how do I then translate that delight so that you can translate it into other people?
Mm.
And that's a very important part. And that's where the community comes into it. So not only do I say, I'm going to delight you, the individual, but I'm actually going to make it my bounden duty, my bounden passion to
Right.
delight the community.
Well, if you think about it, if you have let's just take an example, the beginning of the day.
Mhm.
If you have a poor experience or a negative experience or something that doesn't feel right to you in the morning, unless you're able to compartmentalize and not
Mhm.
allow it in, that impacts how you commence your day. Yet if you have a fantastic experience,
Mhm.
right, that also will impact and influence how you commence your day and how you communicate and how you are with other people. So,
100%. And I mean, I think if people want to know authentically what we mean, it was interesting before we started on the podcast, you and I were giggling like, what, school children?
yes.
Might have been worse. But the point of the matter is, but that kind of um, authenticity, that kind of happiness, spontaneity, that
Yeah.
translates into how then you conduct your conversation. No,
Absolutely.
I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, interesting then. So let's veer back to feelings
Mhm.
in terms of we were going to talk about emotions. So how do both positive and negative emotions shape our connection to and our perception of community? Actually, we just kind of actually were almost
Well, I tell you
on
what, I'm going to go
similar
back.
lines.
I'm going to go back with you on one word there, and that's the word feeling.
Hmm.
Um, Feelings and beliefs are two different things,
Absolutely.
and they need to be stated as separate entities. I know in the business world, when you used to say, or I used to say something like, I feel that we can do something or other. I used to get yanked sort of by somebody, usually by an accountant. Do you
Right.
feel it or do you believe it? So
Mm.
that's
Mhm.
fair enough. So when you actually have a conviction, you want to be able to verify the information, and that is part of the belief system. In a way, Respectonomics is very does this very consistently. We're
Mhm.
always trying to verify our information for accuracy, for consistency, and reliability. So the feeling part about it is one of the most important parts to the puzzle is my looking at you as an individual and say, how are you feeling? As you know, I wasn't a well boy yesterday,
Right.
and I got a note this morning. How are you today? How are you? In fact, no. How are you feeling?
Right.
That in itself is a very warming, it's a very symbiotic kind of way of where one human being can work with another. One of the things that this goes back to my upbringing, possibly, I don't know, I shouldn't say anybody else's. We were discouraged from having feelings. There
Hmm.
was something wrong with I feel whatever. We were more or less told to get behind ourselves and push ourselves forward. And I think
Right.
we've all come a long, long way from that world. But nonetheless, it is important that we have the ability to ask people how they feel. And a big, big word in respectonomics is reciprocity.
Hmm.
I ask you how you're feeling, you ask me how I'm feeling. And I think that is the almost substantively is putting the feelings on the table. Feelings are wonderful because they don't have to be accusatory, they don't have
Right.
to be complimentary, they don't have to have any angle to them.
Hmm.
But if I said to you today, I'm feeling achy, there's nothing right or wrong about that.
Right. It's your
Yesterday,
sta
I
it's
would have
how
said,
you're feeling. They're
yeah.
your. You own
But
them.
I think
Yes.
this is the one part of when we talk about relationships in a community, relationships in our families and siblings, anybody we want to do, understanding their feelings, even asking the question, how are you feeling?
Hmm.
And I think the people closest to us are so often the ones we don't actually ask that question.
Right. I,
It's,
I think for me, it boils down to empathy and compassion,
mhm,
right?
right. Yeah.
You're
And
thinking about how you're feeling.
yeah,
You know you weren't well yesterday. Well, how are
yeah,
you feeling today?
yeah, yeah.
Right?
I think empathy is an interesting word because what you're doing is you're trying to put yourself in that person's place. In other words, you've got a cold, so what does it feel like? Well, the way to find out how it feels is to ask you.
Right.
That's
Right.
okay. The one problem with empathy, and you've heard that wonderful line from the lady up at the horse barn who said,
Yes.
empaths have no boundaries. And it was an interesting shot in the dark because what it means is be empathetic, but that doesn't give us or entitle us to go over those lines.
Right.
In other
Right.
words,
Absolutely.
it's too easy to get into the sort of let me tell you how you should feel.
Yes. Yes.
No, that's not what you're asking.
That's not what empathy is. The
No, it
absolute
isn't, but there's that
that
risky.
caveat. Yes. Yes.
Compassion is an interesting word. Again, I can probably take you to the Latin of it, or would you rather not on this one?
Please do.
Okay. Well, we've got the co-word again, which means together, com. But the passion part of it is in fact from patio, which means to suffer. And
Mm.
there's a very interesting point about suffering. Suffering is in fact personal. In other words, I suffer. You can't suffer me. I can only be doing the suffering.
Mm.
If you really want to know, it's called a semi-deponent verb.
Interesting.
Do you want me to say that again? Semi-deponent verb.
Very good.
Thank you. But seriously, it does mean that what we're experiencing is it is intensely personal. It is I
Mhm.
suffer.
Right,
And
right,
what that means is that the other person needs to be aware of the fact that I'm suffering. And to find
right,
out if I'm suffering, that question again is how you're feeling.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Or how is your day going? I think
Yeah,
those are two questions that are very important in building these bridges and relationships with each other.
right. So looking at visibility in community.
Mhm.
So why is visibility important in a community and how does it impact um, the collective well-being?
Well, the visibility we talked about a bit earlier was the one where it's amazing how many people actually see you.
Hmm.
And I mean, the example I gave was going out for your sandwich and 5,000 people see you. But
Right,
in a smaller community, in a smaller setting, we are seen. How often have you been in a setting where somebody says, "Hello, Sarah," and you look completely blankly? How on the earth do they know that I am Sarah? Or
right.
more
Yes.
accurately, that I am Jeremy? But the truth is that we are seen. And how we are seen is part of that whole business of how we interact, how we behave with other people.
Hmm.
I find one thing I found interesting in my 50 years of being in the investment business, and I always wore a suit. And I was going around, country farmers and, people that were in the gravel business or whatever. But all these people, do you know, in 50, I think 50 or 40 years anyway, in 40 years, only once was I ever asked if I wanted to take my jacket off.
Hmm.
Because, in other words, they saw it as my uniform.
Right.
It's a bit like in a
Right.
hospital. If a nurse is there in in a white, what would you call it? Outfit, smock, whatever you call it.
Right.
Yeah. You kind of expect it. It's part of the
Well, you assume they're working.
exactly, which of
Right.
course I was. And what I think that all this means is when you're looking at yourself visually, it is a good question to say, how will I be seen? As you
Hmm.
know, the alter ego to Jeremy is the one who is out driving tractors and plowing and all kinds of
Right.
important jobs. And I do remember once I was very, very, very mucky. And I was in the parking lot at the local grocery store, and a voice yelled across from the parking lot, "Where did you rent that outfit?"
Oh,
Because they didn't exactly expect me to be in snubby grubbies.
right.
Yeah. So anyway,
No,
but I think, sorry.
no, go ahead, please.
No, go on, please, Sarah.
I was going to say that's very interesting that you made that comment because do you believe that too much visibility can lead to challenges such as judgment or exclusion? So right there in my mind when you shared that story,
Hmm.
somebody was that was a judgment, if you will.
I think you're asking a question that I will turn around a little bit, and that's say, when we have a high visibility, we
Hmm.
have to recognize that with that comes great risk and
Right.
also great opposition.
Mm.
And that's just a fact. So when people come up to you, I mean, that was a good, I mean, that was a fun thing. But other
Yes, of
people
course.
can say, well, you were at such and such an event and you commanded the show and blah, blah, blah. And they're being critical of you. That is one of the costs or the prices of
Yeah.
being on stage, if you will. And I think
Challenge to balance that.
I don't know. I think in fairness, it's almost a recognition. But I
Mm.
think one of the things I've come to grips with is when we get what I think is I call it a false accusation. You know, the one when you are very visible and somebody decides they're going to bring you down. You know that
Yes.
when they want to do that. I'll give you an example of that in a second. No, I'll do it right now. For one of the ladies at the local bakery store this week, she was out skiing and she was skiing for 2 or 3 days. And I said to her, "That's great. What were the crowds like?" And she said, "Well, they get very busy between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock in the morning." Oh,
Mm.
I said, okay. And she said, "Yes," she said. "And those people are usually the older people and the pensioners, which makes sense." And
Hmm.
she said, "They are so rude." I said, "What do you mean?"
Oh.
Exactly. And she said, "Because they sit there in the, what do they call those, the chairlifts,
Hmm.
saying, why are there so many young people out there they ought to be working.
Mm.
Well, as it turns out, this lady keeps two jobs going, manages a horse barn. This is a lady who knows what work is.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in fact, it was a totally unfair comment in every sense.
What's unfounded? They don't know the
Unfounded.
information behind it.
Exactly. And that's the
Yeah.
thing, though. So when
Yeah.
you're in a situation where you have this high visibility and you're being taken down for not a good reason, it's not out of
Right.
arrogance or any of those nasties.
Yes. Yes.
When you're being taken down, one of the things I find very helpful is to be very mindful of my own dignity and my own self-worth. We
Hmm.
can't express dignity into another person's life if we don't have the dignity of ourselves. If we have the
Awareness.
dignity of ourselves, which binds together the body and the mind and the soul, when we bring those three to the table within ourselves, that kind of comment can be, oh, well, that's what you think. You can
Right.
dismiss it. It doesn't even get on the radar, actually.
It's awareness.
Yeah. So I think that's the important part of this whole discussion, that the dignity that we can make into other people's lives must reflect the dignity we have in our own.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So important. When it comes to listening, and we're talking about community, what does active listening look like in a community context, and why is it critical?
Why are you asking me that?
Because I would love our listeners to be provoked by thought and perhaps understand what the importance of
It's
that is.
very, very difficult to listen. The classic, I mean, the only time you really, 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 really listen, truly listen, is when you're being introduced to somebody. And, if you were being introduced to the king or to the president or something, and they say, "This is Sarah." And all you want to hear is that my name? Did you say it properly? I want to hear it again. Yes, this is me. And you forget that you're actually talking to somebody and that you should be trying to find out what their name is. How many times have you been in a setting where, you've been introduced and you haven't got a clue what their
You
name
say you
is?
walk away and 2 minutes later you go, oh my goodness, what was
Yeah,
their name?
exactly. Because you listen to your own first. So listening to yourself is very, very easy to do.
That, or you just have so many other thoughts going on in your
Yeah.
mind and what's going on, the ability to
Ah,
pause, present,
that is a huge issue because
right?
today listening is in fact very difficult. We are deluged. I mean, you
It's a
talk about the
skill.
internet, you talk about, instant communication, voices coming from nowhere. I don't know if you have this, but you click on something on your internet page or something, and suddenly there's a voice talking to you. You didn't
Hmm.
even ask it to speak to you, but there it
Right.
is.
Yes.
So we get a lot of that, and it's easy to cut people out just because I've heard enough. I can't handle it anymore. So I
Yes.
think, to be fair, it's difficult to hear.
Hmm.
I find it, as a human being, I find it difficult to listen because I'm formulating ideas. So you've said something, and I immediately think about that. What I just missed was the last 10 words of what you said.
Right.
So there is one solution to this, and that is for me to repeat to your satisfaction the
Hmm.
last word you actually said,
Hmm.
because that forces me to listen to everything you said. And then when I repeat that word, the last word back to you, you are actually shocked because you go, my goodness, he was listening.
Yes. Yes. I find one of the other unique skills, we're very similar to that, is
Mm.
you summarize back to make sure it is
Ah,
you understand what it is that the individual you're having conversation with or dialogue with, that you've understood what it is that they've said. And that does, it is a skill to listen,
mhm.
right? There's a difference between listening and active listening. Absolutely. And like you say, I don't think it's intentional on people's part sometimes. I think it's like you just said, you've got, and I said you've got so many things that are scrolling through your brain, or you're thinking about something that they said and formulating a thought process or a question that, like you say, you're then missing pieces of it. So it is definitely a skill.
You see, the skill you're talking about, and there I specifically did what we should do. The last word you said was skill. I'm
Hmm.
picking up on that word skill. In order
Right,
to get to the word skill, I actually had to hear and listen to everything you just said.
right, right. Right.
And it's an
Practice
example
technique.
of how it works. And that
Right.
skill of listening, I believe, is a skill as distinct from being a sort of natural, oh, I will always hear things. You may
Right.
hear them, but you're not listening.
Correct.
It's a
There's a
skill.
difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
How can communities foster environments where every voice feels heard, especially marginalized ones?
I think this issue of being marginalized is probably far more intense than we think of. It's so easy to think of a marginalized individual as somebody who's, let's just say, at the end of the social scale, whatever people mean by that. You know, the old definition was being on welfare or something, and one thing Respectonomics is extraordinarily cognizant of is
Mm,
the equality of the human being. I don't mean
yeah.
that we're equal in the sense that we all do the same things and that. I don't mean that at
Right.
all. But I do mean equality in the sense of the composition of the human being and the need to respect each of those components
Mhm.
of the human being.
Absolutely.
But the problem I think about including everybody is I think it's almost structural. Peter
Mm,
Drucker,
okay.
remember, he said that every year gets everybody together.
Yes.
And doesn't matter who you are. You can be the chief financial officer. You can be the one who's filling in the forms for rental cars. Whatever it is you're doing, everybody has to come to the same meeting at the same time to answer one question, which is, what is our business?
Hmm.
At least that gets people engaged, shall we say? Because I think part of your question is not just how do you get people and how do you hear them and so on, but it's actually engaging them.
Hmm.
I mean, certainly in my work life, I can think of too many examples where I did not feel engaged.
Right. Definitely.
Sam Walton, Walmart. I think one of his most brilliant lines used to be, we know what we're doing right because the numbers tell us that. Now tell us what we're doing wrong.
It's a window for engagement.
It really is. So the
It's an
windows for
invitation.
engagement,
An
I like that a
invitation.
lot. And I think it's a
Yes.
very attractive way to look at it and call it a window for engagement.
Hmm.
I think you and I were talking earlier about surveys that we took or we were involved with, and you knew that it was a box ticking exercise, and that was the
Yes.
sum total of its effectiveness. That was
It
it.
almost feels like you're fulfilling a requirement, a business requirement
Yeah,
to say, we did this.
yeah, yeah.
But then
Check
what do
off
you
that
do with it?
box. Yeah,
What do you do with it after?
yeah,
That's the
yeah.
key.
Right.
How do you deal with that
Yeah.
information?
Yeah. I will say one thing though, sorry, going back to your engaging people. I think
Mm,
one of the techniques that we can all engage in, and again, community, families, organizations, business politics, it doesn't matter which strand you're looking at, but there's huge benefit in small groups.
mm,
If you think about it, you and I are part of a small group. We belong to
yes.
the Dignity Trust. And the Dignity Trust has no what you call hierarchy. Nobody's into pride of authorship or anything. It's a mechanism so that we can exchange ideas.
Yes.
And a
Yes.
small group that comes together to exchange ideas. And it doesn't matter what your background is.
Hmm.
In fact, the more different your background, the better.
I was going to say that's the benefit
Mm,
I see as a positive
yeah.
benefit, right?
I'd like to see more
Different
small groups being
perspective.
encouraged. I'd like to see municipalities, for example, you know, everybody says the municipality should be having garbage collection twice a week, whatever it is. I don't want to have a small group, and this is where they get it wrong. The municipality gets people together to study a particular phase of the municipal operation,
Mm,
you know, affordable housing, for example. And these are things we should be doing. But under the heading of engagement, arbitrarily putting people together and saying, you pick up the subject you want to talk about
hmm.
and just see what you come up with.
Right.
That kind of freedom or latitude is very valuable.
What do you think makes people withdraw from their communities? And
Well,
and and,
I
and
think
what can communities do?
yeah, when you withdraw from the community, when you withdraw from the relationship, we talked a bit about the duration issue. When somebody isn't paying attention to me, eventually I will withdraw. That's just the human nature of it. And so part of the withdrawal process is intentional and deliberate, and people need to be able to do it. They need the enabling to do it. I was told once, a fellow who was on a very high-end real estate advisory board in Toronto, actually,
Hmm.
and it was to do with how do you get rental housing more available. I mean, pretty big subject, and it had all
Yes.
the kings and pins in the arrangement. The point was, at some stage, he decided he didn't want to do it anymore,
Mm.
and that's actually what he said. I don't
Right.
want to do this anymore. Nothing wrong with that. And it's a very
Self,
strict, it's a,
self-preservation or
yeah,
protecting
yeah,
oneself, right?
yeah. Can be for any reason.
Right.
Might be
Absolutely.
health reasons, it might be business demands. But he just said, I don't want to do this anymore.
Hmm.
And the reason I think people withdraw from society is this whole issue of people not feeling engaged. And when you
Mm.
don't feel engaged, it's that horrible word of incremental or
Hmm.
accretive, or it adds to itself, it compounds itself. It
Right.
just makes it more and more easy to withdraw.
I think when you don't feel engaged, you feel dismissed.
Hmm.
And then out of protection, it's easier for
Yeah,
you to be yourself, to
yeah,
remove yourself
yeah,
versus you feeling like somebody's told you to leave, if that makes
exactly.
sense.
It makes
Yeah.
absolute sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, eventually we respond with, well, if you don't want me, I don't want to be with you either. It's a
Yes.
very,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a functional equation, really.
Hmm. And I sort of the next question I could sort of be a topic all in of its own, but in terms of from a therapy standpoint, how do you think therapy helps individuals navigate the roles and relationships within a community?
Well, I have a
And what do you mean by therapy?
Yeah, well, let me give you one example of how I've come to this conclusion.
Okay.
I am 74, and everybody agrees I look like I'm 35. Yes? Just say it once.
I was going to say 34.
Oh, well, that makes me feel better again. Then I go. But seriously, one of the problems is you get to my age, and I love driving my tractors. That's my
Hmm.
gig. And you and I shouldn't say you, but I certainly know people who are on the road or driving farm machinery who should not be doing it any longer.
Yes.
Mhm. And one of the techniques that I've adopted is I went to my son-in-law, who is a farmer, and he's what, 30 years my junior, younger. And I said to him, Andy, when you think I'm no longer able, for whatever reason, to drive a tractor, will you please tell me? So number
Right.
one, I've authorized him to do it.
Right.
Number two, the reason for that is it's not really self-preservation. As a matter of fact, it could well be put that I'm not going to hurt somebody else.
Right.
But the
Yes.
biggest reason of all is how many of us actually recognize our own weaknesses, fallibilities, and so on. Some of them we're very aware of, and that we've talked about those. But
Yes.
there are things that happen that we just don't understand. We don't realize that we don't see things or hear things or whatever it is the way we used to, but other people do. You've had that conversation when you say, oh, so and so's getting deaf. And if you actually
Right.
said that to the individual, they'd look at you in amazement and say, what are you talking about?
Right. Right.
What I'm getting at on the therapy part of it is it's an opportunity for somebody to be authorized to bring to my attention what is it that I could be doing differently? What is my human wiring that I don't fully understand that I can engage better with other people? I think it's almost self-preservation to have a
Hmm.
therapist, but I think it's
Yes.
also a way of minimizing the risk of hurting somebody else.
And like we say that when we mean by therapy, that could mean a multitude
Of course.
of
Yeah.
conduits
Yeah,
from
exactly. I mean, it could be, for some people, it can be a faith leader. In other people, it could be the proverbial mentor.
right.
I think we've
Right.
all had mentors in our lives.
Mhm.
There's the technical qualified therapist, and each of us should
Right.
be very free and very able to select one or more of the above. And you and I,
Right.
as the what you might call the onlookers, we should do everything to encourage it and to give it full approbation and say, this is great that you're doing that. In the old days,
Absolutely.
do you remember if you said to somebody, I'm going to get psychiatric help or something, you were
Hmm.
almost scorned. There was some kind
Yes.
of,
Yes. Yeah. It's making it comfortable
yeah,
and making it feel making people not feel ostracized
exactly.
and and making people understand that there's, like you say, there's a multitude of platforms of
Yeah,
therapy
yeah,
and that it's a positive thing,
yeah. And
right?
I think, frankly, all of which adds to the enjoyment of life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. How do you think respectonomics can fit into community relationships? How
Well,
can we positively
I
impact?
think the whole business of respectonomics, as you know, and as we've talked about so often, is building up, it's restoring, it's restating, it's rejuvenating. My latest word is rekindling,
I like it.
yeah, the dignity of the human being. And I think that what Respectonomics does is it does two things. One is it makes the awareness of this dignity very, very not only important, but almost like the starting gate to all of our relationships, whether
Hmm.
they're corporate, political, family, whatever it is. That the
Yes, yes.
dignity of the human being is first and foremost. And you and I were talking about this some time ago. The tragedy is, if you look at the dignity of the human being, how often that has been marginalized or hijacked over the centuries. This isn't
Yeah.
unique to the 2020s. This has been going on for a very, very long time.
Hmm.
And as my mother would have said, it can't go on like this.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think restoring our dignity is extraordinarily important. And I think Respectonomics, as I say, it brings you the awareness or brings us the awareness. It's brought me awareness. And I think the other thing is to give us the tools. So whether it's
Agreed.
the listening, whether it's the visibility, whether it's the empathy, whether it's the drawing alongside, whether it's the mindfulness of everybody has this composite of body and mind and soul, bring this all together. Surely is an answer, not an answer, but at least a recipe to getting a better meal.
Agreed. Absolutely. Such an important
Mm.
opportunity to have an impact and
Mm-hmm.
influence and support, right?
Yeah.
I know you mentioned a great topic in conversation today. I know you mentioned that there was something else you would like to add at the end of our conversation today.
Well, my ending line is, as you know, and the one we've become sort of, it's become our sign off, which is I rest my case. So
Yes.
I rest my case. And then there's a postscript. And the postscript is seriously, this business of respectonomics is one that you and I and the Dignity Trust have explored and worked on in extraordinary detail. It's
Yes.
got a lot of substance to it, it's got a lot of meaning to it. And I'm now going to do something almost like throwing down the gauntlet and saying to the listeners, you tell us what you want to hear about, number one. Let us know that. But also, we need to be in a world where we allow this process to be engaged more fully with more people. That can happen in workshops, it can happen in dinner speeches, it can happen in presentations, it can happen individually. But whatever it is, Respectonomics needs to be on the daily menu. And I think people now need to hear that they've heard the message, they've heard from different points of view. Respectonomics is covers an enormous scope of human endeavors. And I think it's time for us all to take this very, very seriously and to allow people to engage in it more fully. So,
Fabulous
and you
opportunity.
and the way you do it is by writing to Jeremy at respectonomics.com. And then we can take it from there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the conversation
So,
today, Jeremy, and thank you for the call out there to everybody to take the opportunity to engage and see how we can help support and guide and and make things better.
and make things better. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, no, wait. We rest our case.
We rest our case.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks,
Have a
Sarah.
good day. Thanks.
Bye.